We are delighted that this episode of Starts at the Top is sponsored by Avato CRM Solutions. Avato CRM Solutions designs and delivers award-winning customer service, business process outsourcing, and digital and intelligent automation solutions for some of the world's most respected brands, as well as innovative charity and public sector clients. They partner with clients to help them define their customer experience and transformation strategies by implementing the right technology, people, and processes to improve their customer journey while driving new efficiencies and helping them prepare for the future. To find out more about how Avato CRM Solutions could help an organisation like yours and to receive a free, no obligation chat, visit avato.co.uk/Wales Air Ambulance.
We always have a check-in before we get into the tasks. We ask the question, how are you doing? What's the emotional measurements of how you are feeling in your job as well? When you get an opportunity to build your own culture, these are some of the important things.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leadership, digital and change. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast is all about leadership and brings you interviews with leaders who we believe are driving positive change in the world.
Change comes in many forms, and we're equally interested in speaking to leaders who are making incremental change and shifting the dial within their organisations, as we are speaking about huge systemic changes that impact the world of work. The driving force of this podcast is to share these stories across sectors and industries so that we can all learn from each other.
Today, we're sharing the first episode of 2 with a focus on mental health. This week, we're sharing our conversation with Lindsay OBE, founder of Power the Fight, an award-winning charity which tackles violence affecting young people. Ben shares his thoughts on how his team builds and sustains resilience and mental strength to cope with the challenges they face on a daily basis. It's a fantastic conversation, and Ben is an inspiration, so we hope you enjoy that one.
Our next episode will be our interview with Sarah Hughes of Mind, and that was also a wonderfully insightful and thoughtful conversation about the work that Mind does, shining a light on the challenges surrounding mental health in the UK.
So, given the topic of mental health, this week Zoe and I thought we would share a few personal and honest thoughts on our own mental well-being challenges. And the next time out, maybe some thoughts on coping mechanisms and how we try to stay mentally healthy. So let me start by asking you, Zoe, how are you?
I'm okay. I've had a bit of an overwhelming day just with a number of power cuts in this area, and then also just the weather and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm not too bad. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. And it's that sort of thing, isn't it, that completely disrupt your day, throw you off your path. And I guess in this sort of busy climate, that's one of the things that we all struggle with is time. And if time gets disrupted, especially during the working day, then that can throw all kinds of spanners into the works. What do you do? What do you make of time and the pressures?
I think that's one of the things that can have a real impact on mental health, can't it? So you and I have spoken before about the overwhelm that comes with modern working life and having a million emails to deal with, lots of different requests coming in, trying to juggle work and family. I'm sure that is a challenge that many of our listeners will know really, really, really well. And then also there's that whole thing of feeling like you need to be in several different places at once. And I don't know whether any of our listeners maybe can relate to this, but I'm one of these people who there's a very fine line for me between being really busy to the point where I feel really kind of energized and excited because I've got so much going on. And then suddenly it gets to a point where it's like putting an extra plate on top of a really big pile of plates. It goes from a point where it all feels good and I feel like I'm getting lots of things done to actually, this is a bridge too far and this is getting really quite difficult now.
Yeah, I get that as well. When you're at your busiest, sometimes that's the most energizing, isn't it? You sort of think, you can't be beaten. Everything's fine, and you're on a roll. And then that last thing, and it's usually a silly thing, really silly thing. It's just the bit that makes everything topple over, and then you're in a bit of a spiral. Then you can't get back from it. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest battle for me is that sense of time, not being able to control time, not having enough of it. It's passing too quickly. I have a really weird relationship with it where I always think it's running out rather than there's bags of it, if that makes sense. So yeah, maybe not glass half empty, but more hourglass half empty.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, isn't it? And I think as you get older, that does feel like something you become more aware of, definitely.
Yeah. And then just, on another one that I sort of wrote down, I was thinking about, what are the sorts of things that stress me out? And I don't think I actually thought of this. We've mentioned this several times on the podcast. I don't think I really focused on mental health when I was, working full-time, traveling into London. There wasn't really, sounds ridiculous, but there wasn't really time to focus on it. And I think it's the pandemic that's forced it on me. And then obviously, I think, again, we talked about this on this podcast before. My dad died last year and he had vascular dementia. And always in the back of my mind is that sort of sense of, well, if he had it, do I have it? So I get inordinately stressed out by not being able to remember things. And it's nothing, I don't think it is anything to be concerned about just yet. And that's another thing. Should I go out and get myself checked up? Should I go and have some of the tests that my dad had and all that sort of stuff? But that sort of sense that forgetting stuff and not remembering what's next. I've got surrounded by Post-it notes and always talking about how the stress of sort of context switching and things like that can leave you a bit exhausted. But I think it is just that for the time being. It's stuff that piles up and, as I said, the context switching between things. But there's that worry in the back of your mind. It's all sort of time and memory related, and it sends again you into a bit of a sort of a spiral from time to time.
And I think that is really normal. And I do think there's something about the ongoing impact of going through an ongoing mental health impact of life changes that tend to happen around this age, and also that many people will have experienced during the pandemic as well. I, as you know, also lost someone I really cared about, a really good friend of mine, about a year ago. And the start of this year, after Brad's 6-month anniversary, was really hard mental health wise. It was incredibly difficult, really, really difficult. And one of the things that Ben talks about in the interview that we're going to play shortly is he talks about the value of therapy. And if I hadn't had been fortunate enough to have access to regular therapy, I would have really, really struggled during that time. So I'm a massive advocate for therapy. The way I always say it is it's a bit like having a personal trainer for the mind, someone who can help keep you mentally in really good shape and also support you when you're going through a really rough period. So that is something I would always encourage people to seek out.
You'll be pleased to know it's on a Post-it on the bottom of my monitor. I've got a Post-it that says, "Do I need a coach?" And underneath that it says, Do I need a therapist? But it's on a to-do list. It's on a Post-it, but it's one of those things, isn't it? And I as you know, I always like to get football into the podcast, but I listen to a lot of football podcasts. And quite often, I guess because of the predominant audience, don't think it's wrong to say that predominant audience of some of the male football podcasts is going to be male football fans. And one of the things that they constantly advertise is BetterHelp, which is the online therapy, which again feels like it's a sort of an idea to explore at some point. One of those things that floats around in the back of my mind, but I haven't actually activated yet. So I'm not going to ask you what sort of things you discuss with your therapist, but how does that work? Is it a regular session, or is it something that you can sort of dial up when you need to dial it up?
Oh, I'm really happy to talk about this. I mean, this episode and also the next one, amazing conversation with Sarah, and of course this amazing conversation we have coming up with Ben. I think it's good to be open about this stuff. So I see my therapist every 2 to 3 weeks for now. I talk to him online, and we either talk about things that have happened to me when I was quite young. I had quite a difficult childhood because my dad died when I was basically a child, and that was really difficult. And other than that, we tend to talk about, just the sort of like particular things that might have happened at work or maybe family that I might have found a bit challenging. And I always feel better afterwards. I've never had a therapy session and regretted it or thought that wasn't a really good use of an hour. It's a bit like, when you go to the gym or you go for a run or something and you're thinking, oh God, should I be doing this? And actually there's that extra thing when you go to therapy where you're thinking, oh, this is going to be quite difficult. And I actually genuinely don't like talking about myself, which might come as a surprise to people who go, God, she's just written another of her 500 blogs this week. But I actually genuinely don't like talking about very personal things with people I don't know that well. But it's always been really useful and really constructive. And yeah, I really, really encourage people to do it. I think if you're thinking about doing it, it's a really good sign that you should do it. And if something doesn't feel quite right, even if you can't define what that is, then definitely go and see someone and explore it. And if you can't afford therapy, go to talk to your GP, because there may be some therapeutic services you can access through the NHS, or even just talk to a really, really good friend. I think getting stuff out on the table, having a look at it, there's almost a digital way of doing things, isn't there? Of that, what is this problem? We know something isn't right, but let's define what this problem is. And I'm a great believer that once you can see the edges of a problem, even if it's something huge and scary, you got to give something a name. You give something a name, and then you can do something about it. So I'd encourage anyone listening who's not feeling great or who's just worried about something, there's some recurring thought or worry or fear, whatever it is, where it's just coming up in your mind again and again. It's a bit like that niggly pain that you might think, actually, I need to go and see a doctor about that. Just do it. You won't regret it.
Good advice. Maybe I should take up myself. I think it's well worth doing that. And of course, I think one of the many benefits of doing this podcast is that we get to speak to people with all sorts of different experiences, and this comes up a lot. So it feels like we sort of have every few days when we do a podcast recording, another chance to have a conversation with somebody else that's sort of facing challenging situations. And the benefit, I guess, of you and I having that sort of 10, 15 minutes chat before and after a podcast recording, checking in with each other and making sure we're both okay and on an even keel, I guess, is the best way to put it. So the next time we speak, what we will do is we will share some of our coping mechanisms. You've already mentioned Zoe running. Music is another one, but we can talk through a bit about how we get ourselves out of these little episodes of annoyance or frustration or mental ill health. Anyway, should we get on with our interview?
Perfect.
So now for our interview with Ben Lindsay.
We are very excited to welcome Ben Lindsay OBE to Starts at the Top. Ben is founder of Power the Fight, launched in 2019. It's an award-winning charity which tackles violence affecting young people, creating long-term solutions for sustainable change and acting as a link between the community and policymakers. Ben was winner of the Charity Times 2022 Rising Leader Award and one of the Evening Standard's Progress 1000 London's most influential people for 2018. He's an experienced presenter, trainer and facilitator with more than 20 years spent working with high-risk young people in the field of gangs and serious youth violence. Ben began his career developing programmes in some of the most challenging estates in London. In 2003, he became a learning mentor at a primary school in the borough of Lewisham, before joining the Lewisham Youth Offending Service, where he worked in a number of roles, including leading the early intervention team. Whilst at Lewisham, Ben developed several successful programmes, including the groundbreaking knife crime prevention programme, Double Edge, for offenders of knife crime, which was featured in the Gang and Group Offenders, a Practitioner's Handbook of Ideas and Interventions. In 2010, Ben developed the Gangs and Serious Youth Violence Strategy for Camden Council, and then went on to work for the mental health charity MAC UK, leading their Mini-MAC project. Ben was chair of the Greenwich Independent Advisory Group until 2016. Between 2016 and 2020, Ben was lead pastor at Emmanuel New Cross in South East London. He currently sits on the Mayor of London Sadiq Khan's Violence Reduction Unit Reference Group and on the Cross-Party Youth Violence Commission. His first book, the #1 bestseller, We Need to Talk About Race, Understanding the Black Experience in White Majority Churches, was released in 2019. Ben was awarded an OBE in King Charles First New Year's Honours List for services to communities in South East London. Ben, welcome to Starts at the Top. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's always funny when I hear all that stuff which you just said. So is that really me? But yeah, apparently it was. So yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You have quite the bio, and you've obviously done so many amazing things, which we're really excited to talk to you about. And obviously there's a common thread, isn't there, running through all this fascinating and very valuable experience you've had around tackling violence affecting young people. Could you take us back to the moment when you felt you'd found your calling?
Yeah, I mean, I think the moment probably was around 2001, and I was working in the city, and I was working for Ofcom. No, I was working for Oftel, which then became Ofcom. So, kind of all around telecommunications, and that was one of the first jobs I had coming out of university. I was one of the press office managers for Oftel. It was a very interesting time when kind of mobile phone licenses were just being distributed, and it was a very busy time. But at the same time, in the evenings, I was just volunteering in youth clubs and youth centres. And what happened was, at the time, I just recently started going to church, and I became a Christian, even though I was brought up in a Christian home. I'd kind of discovered Christianity for myself. And it was at that moment where I felt, oh, well, what does this really mean? Yes, I get the individual, personal relationship I now have with the church and with Jesus. But what does that really mean for the community? How do I give myself and serve the community? What does that really mean? So me and a few friends just decided to go to various estates in South East London. We'd take our turntables and our microphones, and we'll just go and serve kids. And I loved it, but then it got to a point where I was doing a lot of that stuff in the evening and my day job, and then there was an opportunity to take voluntary redundancy in 2003 at Oftel before it became Ofcom, and I just thought, you know what, I think I can maybe do this full time. But there was a young man called Emmanuel who lost his life 2004. And I suppose that was the moment where I thought, actually, we need more. We need more people like myself who grew up in South East London, who understands the culture, understands what young people and families go through. He was a lovely young boy. We used to do a football club in a local secondary school, and I think the environment around him caught up with him, and he lost his life. But I suppose that was the first young person I had known and worked with and mentored who'd lost their life, and I was like, okay, I don't want to see anybody else lose their lives, so let me just put as much energy and time into this as I could. So it was probably the early noughties were the moments where I kind of felt my calling.
And that was the moment that really spurred you on to make a difference, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think the way I look at engaging with trauma and engaging with particularly young people impacted by violence or at risk of, is that there's kind of two avenues you can go down. One, you've experienced trauma and pain, suffering and violence yourself. And what tends to happen is that people then think, because I've been through that experience, I can give my learning and my experience to young people in that way, which I think is fine. I think there's another approach though, which is probably where I sit, which is, okay, I have not personally gone through knife crime, gang crime. I've not personally been in a gang. I've not gone to prison. I grew up around a time when that stuff was around me, but my lived experience isn't that. And therefore, because I can slightly detach my emotions, I can actually maybe be a good person to practically, proactively work in this space. And that was me. I just thought, well, actually, I'm not traumatized by this stuff. So let me come with as much help and support as possible to the young people around me. That was just something which I felt I could do. And that has served me well as time has gone on over the last 20 years. The communities that I've worked with, the families and young people I've worked with, I suppose because I am quite trauma informed in my approach, it's just meant that I can probably just take the sting and the emotion a little bit out of the work that I do, because I've not lived through it myself. Whereas what I've seen with some people with lived experience, there always comes a moment where burnout comes. And I think that happens to a lot of people, and it did happen to me around 2011. But I think it comes quicker with those who have had lived experience, and particularly when you haven't got the clinical support, clinical supervision around you. So I think that served me well. That was probably my moment where I felt I could do this because I'm just looking at this from a slightly different perspective.
How did the young people react to that around you? Do they sort of think, well, actually, if you haven't been through this, then how do you know? What do you know? Or do they look for a mixture of both that lived experience and somebody that's grown up around it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think it's just there's levels to it. I don't know if I think there's a bit of a myth that young people think I can only relate to the ex gang member, or I can only relate to the person who's gone to prison. And I always kind of say, well, you want to really engage with the person who got caught or the person who didn't. So that's and that is to say that, you know, I'm not saying that I've always had a squeaky clean lifestyle. You know, I've never been involved in anything illegal, but there's been definitely moments when I've been around people where you have to make a choice whether you go left or right. So I think my experience would be, I've seen people go down and take the wrong turn. I've been fortunate enough to make decisions, whether it's because of people around me or, you know, just because I was into different things. And I think ultimately children and young people want options. They want to see people who are successes, regardless. It's like, well, if I can say to you that I'm a success in a way which didn't involve drugs and crime, or even the stereotypical side of stuff, I'm not a sportsman, I'm not a musician, you know, but I am a success. Let's look at that. I think children and young people, particularly nowadays, there's an entrepreneurial spirit which most young people have, and they want to learn. And without trying to sound like too much of a capitalist, they just want to see how you make money, you know. And there's people around me and in my circle who, if it is a money conversation, I know people who have made lots of money legally. But if it's even a case of, well, creatively, I know people who are footballers or who are musicians who are doing positive stuff. Okay, we can give you those examples as well. So I think it's just about making sure you've got a wide enough network of people to present different options, which isn't always a case of, I have to do the street stuff, I have to sell drugs, I have to do this. Provide the different examples. And I think like networking is one of my superpowers, I would say. And therefore, because I've got a wide network of people in different sectors, I can use that to inspire families and young people to move in a different way.
And that experience of burnout that you talked about earlier, that feels like such a common thing with many of the leaders actually that we've interviewed for this podcast, because people are very passionate about what they do, and often they're, and I speak for myself, trying to do almost too much. And the other week we had Summer Sarah on, the co-founder of Everyone's Invited, and she talked about some of her experiences with that. You mentioned that you'd experienced burnout. Have you got any advice for leaders out there who might be on the brink of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I experienced burnout probably twice, actually. The first time would have been around 2010, 2011. I just started working at Camden Council, working on a youth violence strategy. But I'd worked 5-6 years prior to that in Lewisham Youth Offending Service, working with very vulnerable young people, high risk young people, families. And what I noticed, we were dealing with death, we were dealing with young people being incarcerated for long sentences. We're dealing with street level violence in the community. And it just wasn't the therapeutic support. There wasn't the clinical supervision. There wasn't a space where you could really unpack the impact of the violence, which was impacting the communities around you. And because of that, by the time I got to 2010, 2011, I was just like, I'm traumatized by what I've seen. I've seen young people lose their lives. I've seen, extreme levels of violence and criminality, sexual violence. I've read the crime reports and the stuff which are going to courts, and it's just too much. So that was the first time. The second time was then in my role as a pastor in a church, and you're dealing with hundreds of pastoral issues. That time is when I caught it, actually, and I was like, actually, I need clinical supervision. I need supervision which is outside line management, where I can have therapeutic support. And I brought this to the church I was working for at the time, and it was a very new concept. They were very much like, what is this? We're not sure we want to pay for. You got pastoral support. Ben, you're a Christian, so if you really have trauma, just pray and read your Bible and God will sort it out. And I was like, nah. I'm like, I'm not saying those tools are not necessary, but actually what I require is somebody who's trained, who understands trauma, and I believe the church should be paying for that. So that was my first push, and eventually they agreed. It went to trustees, and the trustees said, look, if Ben is calling for this, then we should do it. Ironically, then every other pastor later on ended up having clinical supervision. So I pioneered in that space. But that was the moment where I felt I needed somebody who was not connected to the work that I was doing to give me honest conversations and honest support and strategies. And my advice really would be, definitely, if you've got an opportunity, push your employer to give you that clinical therapeutic support. I think if we look at TV shows like, I don't know if you remember that show Billions, which was, I think it was on Sky or something like that, and they had like a psychologist in there being employed. I think it's happening a lot more nowadays, and there's lots of examples where I think it saves something like 1.4 billion of businesses when you have that type of therapeutic support in space. But I think you just have to catch it. And what was helpful for me, actually, I did this for I started, I think it was like 2013. After having a conversation with my employer at the time, which was Emmanuel Church, London, and I spoke about all types of stuff. I thought initially it was just going to be about work, but actually I found myself talking about race as well, and racism, and my own history and what I was feeling at the time. I didn't realize it, but it was preparing me to write my book. And then actually, when I wrote my book and it came out in 2018, when George Floyd happened in 2020, I felt an immense calm. It was very, obviously, it was horrific, which was going on. But while everybody else was trying to like, oh my goodness, we're having this live conversation about racism, I just felt at peace because I dealt with my own issues with race and racism for the last 8 years, and it was fascinating. So definitely, my advice for people is, and I always say this: get therapy even when you think you don't need it. That is my advice to everybody I meet, but it's served me well, and it's served others well.
I completely agree with that, Ben. As you were describing that earlier, everything you said really resonated with me. And I was trying to explain this to someone I mentor actually about the value of leaders and therapy. And I just feel that everything is connected, isn't it? So it's really interesting what you were saying about the professional and the personal. And before I had therapy, I would kind of put those things in different baskets. But actually, everything's connected up, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this idea that you can somehow separate your personal life from your professional life, I think, is a myth. My organisation, Power to Fight, we like to say that we are trauma informed, which means for us, we're in this space where every single member of my team, whether you're my EA to my frontline workers, gets clinical supervision. Now that is expensive. Like, if I'm going to be honest, that is like an extra 40k a year to my budget. But because of my own personal experiences, I really value that highly, that my staff have an opportunity to talk to somebody else outside of line management supervision. And I think we also create reflective spaces as well as a team. So we're very much like, how can we learn from one another, which is really important. We have this employee scheme as well, which is outside of the organization, where if there's things which people want to talk about and they don't feel like they want to talk about it in the context of Power to Fight, then they can go there as well. At every single space and moment, we want to create trauma-informed opportunities and therapeutic opportunities where my staff feel that they can get the best level of support. And we always have a check-in, even my senior leadership team meetings. We spend the first 15 minutes we ask the question, how are you doing? Let's talk personally if you want to share. But let's also, before we get into the tasks, what's the emotional measurements of how you are feeling in your job as well? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you feeling stressed? And if this is the case, why? And we do that. We go around the table to do that. So I think we have, these are things I never really experienced working in youth offending services and community. In statutory organisations, it's just, you haven't really got the space to do that. But when you get an opportunity to build your own culture, these are some of the important things.
That's great. So you're really normalising this conversation about mental health and creating space for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of new things in there. So, for example, for the first time, so one of the things is at my age of 45 years old, it means that I'm in this space where I get to manage younger people and older people. So what is new for me, for example, is I'm now managing older women and we're having conversations about menopause and the desire for a menopause policy and menopause groups being set up, which I think is brilliant. And I've said, yeah, cool. Let's look. We've now got a menopause policy, which we're just looking at the moment, and there's maybe 3 members of staff who are going through the menopause at the moment. I just think this is not something I experienced 20 years ago. These are conversations which were not being had. But I think it's so important that if there's anything which has the potential to make your work life not brilliant, not great, or there's things which are hindering that. And it's complicated. As a man, it's complicated because I don't, my first thoughts were, I don't want anything that somebody's going through for me to feel like that has a potential to stop you from doing your work well. So it's almost, part of me kind of feels, I almost don't want to know, so I don't have stuff in my mind. And then my other part of me was like, no, this is brilliant. We need to get stuff out. We need to have the honest conversations, and then create the work environments which make and help people flourish to the best of their ability. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of where my head is at and the type of organisation we're trying to build.
And that's such a thoughtful way to approach leadership and to think about how you support your team through these different life transitions.
Yeah, I mean, we yes, I mean, whether it's pregnancy, or the other thing something else we've just recently done, which I've never seen before, but we're up for trying other things. That a friend, well, she's a friend who ended up working for Power to Fight, because when you start a small organization, you just try and get your friends to work with you, and then it's kind of like, okay, now you have to go beyond your friendship groups. But she recently got married and said to me, I've had this incredible opportunity to go to Uganda and to work, and I wondered whether I could spend 3 months remotely working in Uganda. And I was like, oh, wow. There's a 2-hour time difference. I was like, it's not too bad. Yeah, the internet can be in and out, but you get that in the UK as well, as it's been demonstrated. So we've really thought it through, looked at the policies, looked at insurance, and yeah, she's out there for 3 months with her husband and their son. And yeah, I like to create the flexibility. She's having an incredible time out there. It's not really impacted the work that she's our digital content lead, so she still gets to run our socials and stuff like that. But it's things like this, which I think as a smaller organisation, you can attempt to try these things out and see how it works out.
Yeah, and I think we've all been through that you mentioned the pandemic when we were talking just before recording, and Zoe and I have noticed that when the conversations that we started with leaders, and we've had, we've done over 50 episodes now and had lots of conversations with many people, and the common trend is that we're all starting to ask more questions of, what is it that I want from my life, whether it's a sabbatical away from the office, and you want to keep good people, you want to give them access to that if you possibly can, all the way through to even bigger life changes, people moving away, and it's all about that retention of talent. You don't want to lose the people that are there. And that there will be other organisations of a similar size out there who are looking at all of these things. There's a pressure as a leader, I think, to try and keep up with those trends that people will come into the office and ask for.
Yeah, and I absolutely. The pandemic changed everything. Hybrid working. What you can do online. I don't know. I think it was just an opportunity for people just to reflect on what's important. Yeah. So yeah, it was a strange moment, as we know, but I think it was also the forced moment for everyone to say, right, what matters? How much productivity can I realistically achieve? How does it impact my emotional and mental health? And I think as a small organisation, we've had to adapt to that. A lot of my team work 4 days. Some of my team take like every other Friday off. It's been agreed, so they can have a longer weekend. For me, I mean, you can't see our offices, but we're in Peckham in a shared kind of office space, but we have 3 offices here, and it's a very nice space. Aesthetics is important for me, and I think sometimes when you think about the work we do with young people, you think of grotty youth centres, and I didn't want that. I wanted us to be in a space where you'd actually want to enjoy coming to work. We've got lots of plants around. There's a wine bar on the 5th floor. There's spaces where you can it's a very nice space. Equipment wise, I've always said I want people to not have broken equipment, so people have like nice mobile phones and some of this stuff people might think doesn't matter, but I actually really want to honour and respect the people who are doing incredible work. We're talking about working with very high risk families, very high risk young people, going above and beyond to keep communities safe. And the least we can do is give them a phone which doesn't break down. So it's kind of these things all, for me, matter, where you've got an opportunity to present the best version of yourself when you're at work.
Yeah. It's certainly given me food for thought, because I'm a trustee of a local organisation here in Hertfordshire, and what we do is help people in crisis. It's that battle between whether they're paying for power or whether they're paying for food, literally, and being able to help people with that sort of thing. So the people that work in the team are constantly faced with conversations, really difficult conversations with people, and we brought that up at a recent trustee meeting about mental health and well-being, and it was, it's not that we want you trained in how to recognize it, it's that we want you to go into some kind of therapy session yourselves because you're dealing with this stuff day in, day out. So it's really, really important. I just wanted to pivot a little bit, but sort of staying with the mental health angle, I guess. So I tried to do a bit of research over the last couple of days, and it's one of those things that I think I'm dipping a little toe in, and it's just got to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So forgive me, but I'm sort of not all there. But I was listening to your interview with Governor B on your Power Talk podcast, and it was fascinating. There was a couple of things that sort of really resonated, and it comes back to the mental health and well-being. I can walk out my front door here and I can walk down to the park and I don't feel threatened. I can put on my running gear. This is something that I thought was very funny when you talked about running, but I can put on my running gear and suddenly I'm conscious that I'm running behind people and I might scare them and boot them out of the way. But one of the things you mentioned, and one of the things that Governor B mentioned, was stepping outside your door in your local community can be, you're on a constant watch. And you talked about things like, when you go running, you put on brightly coloured gear so you don't look threatening running behind people. He talked about going to Parliament and changing his look by putting his hair up. And what I'm interested in just exploring for a minute is that the mental toll that must take on young people living in your area, where every time they leave the house, and this isn't just work related, every time they leave the house, there is that thought in the back of their mind that something could happen. They're always on watch. Could you just talk a little bit about how that sort of presents itself in the work that you're doing, that constant threat of something could happen that perhaps, I don't feel as a tall white man. Zoe probably feels going out, and you've talked about it, Zoe, when you go out for a run or when you go outside of your front door, that vulnerability. Just talk to me about that for a bit, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I think context is everything, really. So my context very much was growing up in the 90s as a teenager in the shadow of Stephen Lawrence being murdered. And Stephen was a friend of some of my friends, and he was murdered a mile away from the school I went to, and I was 15 at the time. So for me, it was a moment, maybe the most important moment of my youth, and it was at a time when the National Front, before the BNP and before EDL, the National Front were the people who were after mainly young black boys and were prepared to really harm them. So that was my context. And our parents would say, it's better that you walk in a group than on your own for safety. Now, that would have been deemed as a gang nowadays, but it was literally like, yeah, we're just going to walk together because we feel safe. Fast forward 30 years, and it's a slightly different ball game for young people now. Whereas my biggest concern was white young men who wanted to kill black boys. A lot of the kids in a in a London context, and we have to be careful when we talk about race and violence. In a London context, violence affecting young people disproportionately impacts black and brown communities. That doesn't mean that this is a black issue. And I always say this, if you take a place like Cleveland, in Middlesbrough or near Middlesbrough, Newcastle, and those places, which is a population where percentages where it's 98% white, they have the highest rate of knife crime in the country. Second is West Midlands, that's a high Asian population, and then you have London. So I have to always clarify that it's not like race and violence doesn't necessarily, collate in that way. However, what I engage with a lot of kids, a lot of black children, a lot of black and brown kids, there's a fear and anxiety about children who look like them. So when I'm in a school context and I hear a young person say, do you know, Ben, are you honestly saying that when you see someone who looks like you don't fear them? And I'm like, well, no, I'm as a 45-year-old man, and if I see someone who looks like me, I'm likely to just either ignore them or politely smile or whatever. That's not what they say. They say, well, if I see someone who looks like me, who I don't recognize, I look at them as a threat. And that's black children, that's white kids, that's boys and girls. I've been in school context. So there is an anxiety and a fear which young people have, which we did not have growing up. And yeah, so there's that level. There's kind of like young people are just fearful. This is why our therapeutic work we do in schools is so important. We're trying to go beyond the headlines. The headline is knife crime, someone's lost their lives. What you don't see is what's led up to that. You've not seen the fear and the anxiety and the concern which the average young person will have. Not necessarily because they've experienced direct violence, but because of the social media, there's a lot of indirect things which kids will pick up through Snapchat and stuff like that. So there's there. But then there is a population of, and I can only talk from my perspective, but there's a population of black men who, let's say, are between the ages of 35 and 45, and maybe even older, who do struggle with the racial profiling which will come from the police, or where it will come from in the form of academics or teachers, and in my case, I live in a very gentrified area in southeast London. And yeah, when I'm running, I am very conscious of the views that my white middle class neighbours will have of me. And I know the difference between me walking down the street with my 3 very cute children and the smiles and I get, and I can then be wearing exactly the same stuff and I'm on my own, and there are no smiles. There are people looking very concerned. Now, some people might be like, well, no one is forcing people, shouldn't have to feel like they should smile. I get that. But you can also tell when there's a little bit of kind of feeling of angst, which you pick up very quickly. And in Governor B's context, he recently had a situation where he was attacked in Blackheath, which is a very gentrified area of southeast London, and completely unprovoked attack where he almost lost an eye just because he was walking past, some white builders. And as shocking as that is, it doesn't actually surprise me because, like you said, we are always on guard. And I think going back to the whole mental health stuff, a lot of actually black men, at least in my friendship group, therapy is a new thing. Again, the pandemic meant that we had to have these conversations on our WhatsApp groups, but so many of my friends still don't go to therapists, don't have therapy, don't engage about their own trauma. We're getting there, but this is a real thing which still impacts us today. So I think when you look at context, when you look at age ranges, the common denominator is fear, but it plays out differently depending on your age, context, and stuff like that.
And it's expensive, right? Isn't it? And that's something he talks about, go and get therapy. Well, it's easy for people to say. I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the Better Health is constantly trailed on these podcasts. And again, I looked at it because, my issues are my issues, but, I looked at it and thought, well, how much is this? And it's even that's prohibitively expensive for somebody that doesn't have readily available money. So I know you talked about some of the stuff you're doing to sort of try and get through that. Can you just tell us a bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So we put out, it was during the pandemic actually, we got some money from the Mayor of London to trial this therapeutic approach, because I think there's a couple of things. One, it's expensive, but from a black and brown perspective, there is in some cases a lot of distrust about white authority. And therefore, when you go to, when you look for clinical support, most of these people are, most of the doctors, most of the clinicians, most of the therapists, most of the counselors, most of the psychologists tend to be white and middle class. And we were going to trial this approach in a school, which was, could we get culturally sensitive therapists, counselors, psychologists, youth practitioners in a school context to kind of produce a co-produced, co-designed mental health approach for young people. We got some money to do that. Then the pandemic happened, and we were like, well, actually, should we turn this into a research project? Let's actually talk to 100 kids, some frontline practitioners, some families, and let's see about what they feel around therapy and the connection to violence affecting young people. And what we got back was, we, the community, do not trust white authority. We appreciate there might be therapeutic support which is needed, but often the waiting lists are too high. There's a lack of trust. And this term cultural sensitivity or cultural competency kept on coming back. That we don't believe that actually the people who want to support us are culturally sensitive. And what does that actually mean? So do you understand the culture and the context that you are serving in? And what we kept on coming back was, actually, you've got young people and families saying, you're not culturally sensitive, but you've also got practitioners saying, we don't feel confident to understand, we don't understand the culture that we are working. So you've got teachers who are saying, I'm in this diverse community, this racially diverse community, different class to what I'm used to, and I don't feel I've got the tools to engage on that level. So that's a massive problem when you've got the young people and families saying you're not culturally sensitive, and then you've got the teachers, police officers, therapists, doctors saying, I don't understand the culture. So for us, we were like, well, actually, we need to bridge the gap here. So yes, we, on the practical level, we can create these co-produced approaches which are engaging with young people, teachers, and parents and carers, with our culturally sensitive therapists and counsellors, etc. But there's also this element of, how do we train teachers and therapists and doctors and police officers to become more culturally sensitive in a very hyper local way? Now, one thing which I don't think you mentioned in my bio was the fact that I'm also doing a PhD at Durham University, and I'm looking very specifically at the lack of cultural sensitivity in teaching. So how do teachers did they get that in their training? And when they then land in a school which is very different to what they're used to, what did the school do in terms of their policy to help them become more culturally sensitive and more culturally aware? So I've just started that as well. So for me, it's really important that we do present as many spaces and opportunities as possible for therapy, for families and young people, but also appreciating that our practitioners and teachers don't feel confident in that space, and we have to upskill them to understand the communities that they're serving better. So that was very long-winded, but I can't unpack it in any other way.
Really. No, I think that's brilliant, Ben, because everything you just said there, and also everything you described this morning, is that there's something there about the spaces for therapeutic approaches around the therapy, isn't there? So there's I'm going to support and resource, very sort of well, and quite rightly, for my staff to access therapy. But it's also about reinforcing that through, we talk about mental health in meetings. We think about some of the kind of, cultural challenges that may exist within the work that we do that will affect people's mental health and well-being. So yeah, I really like the way you've approached this in this very sort of joined up fashion, so that you're thinking about how everything connects with everything else.
Yeah, I think what we call this ground engagement and air engagement. So we have this thing at Power to Fight where we're saying, okay, the ground is very much around the community, therapeutic support and pastoral care, mentoring. How do you effectively get the community voice heard? And then you've got this air engagement is very much around policy and decision making and local government and central government and strategy. And if Power to Fight is anything, we are the conduit between the two. We try and get the community's voices and experiences to move very much a little bit like the water cycle of, the water impacts the ground and then it impacts the air, and it's kind of like this ongoing kind of circular movement. This is what we're trying to attempt to do with the communities who have been impacted by violence. And for me, there's not enough conduit organisations who have got the trust of the community, but also have got the trust of the decision makers. I think this is what separates us from most organisations. Most organisations probably fit into one or the other of those spaces, the air engagement and the ground engagement. What separates us is that, no, we're well respected with policymakers and decision makers and MPs, but we're also known on the ground level of really supporting communities around this issue of violence affecting young people. And I think you've got to keep asking yourself the question, does the community actually have a say in how their communities are governed and supported? And so often it's not that case. So you have to have people who can speak on their behalf and empower them to have that authority in those spaces.
I love that point about ground engagement and air engagement. It feels like the secret's a really good collaboration.
Yeah, I think collaboration is one of my values, and I love, but it's, I always say to my children, like, when your kids are arguing with each other or there's situations which happen in a school context, and I always say, like, just being likable will open you doors more than anything else. That you can have all the intelligence and you can have all the creative ability, but ultimately, if people like you, they're more likely to give you an opportunity. And for me, I think the likability of my team and who I am has meant that we've been able to build not just networks, but diverse networks. And I think when, like, going back to charity for the moment, we have a mixed funding model where it is very much around classic funding, like grants and foundations, but we also work well with corporates, and yes, we have high net worth individuals who want to give, but we have to mix it up. And sometimes the money which comes in are from places which you wouldn't even think would engage with the type of issues that we're dealing with, but we have to widen it up, widen our collaboration and partners, because in the cost of living crisis, it's really difficult. Like our on the ground donations have been cut by 50% in the last year, and because we've got that mixed funding model, it impacts us, but there's other sources of funding. So it's really important from a strategy perspective that you do have multiple funding streams. But a lot of that does come down to relationship and experience. And I've got 20 years in this, and that helps.
Definitely. It's all about the relationships and the networks, isn't it? Ben, this has been fantastic. Thank you. We've learned so much from you this morning. I really loved hearing about your really thoughtful, really innovative approach. Is there anything that you'd like to share about Power the Fight before we wrap up? Where can people go to find out more about you and your team's amazing work?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's been really great talking to you guys. You guys are brilliant. So yeah, you can go to our website. It's www.powertofight.org.uk. You can follow us on all the socials, where it's just Power to Fight UK, Instagram, Facebook. I think we might even have a TikTok, which I don't get involved in, but apparently we've got one.
You're not on there dancing, Ben.
I'm good at many things, but if you notice, dancing was not in my bio, so that's something which is not something which you'll ever see me do, even though my digital content lead would love me to do that. But yeah, we there's things that we are always trying to engage. We've got a crowdfunder at the moment, which we're trying to raise 30k for our continuing our therapeutic support. So yeah, there's lots of different things that you can connect in and engage with at Power to Fight.
Amazing. We'll put some links in the show notes. Ben, thank you so much for coming on. It's been wonderful. Thank you for coming on Start to the Top.
No, it's been
Yeah,
brilliant.
thank you.
Thank you so much. I follow you guys on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I learn a lot from you guys as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank
It's
you.
our pleasure.
Thank you to
Thank
Ben
you.
for making the time to come onto the podcast. You can find more information about Power the Fight via their website at powerthefight.org.uk. That's powerthefight.org.uk. We'll be back in a fortnight with our episode with Sarah Hughes.
You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us, whether Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google.
And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you and bye for now.
See ya.